would like to say a few words about Archives Month. Since 2006, American Archives Month has been an opportunity to remind people that archival records are important for everyone, and that those archival records are being preserved, cared for, and made accessible by archivists. Connecticut's archival records, which date from its earliest settlements to the present, record the rich and diverse history of Connecticut, its contributions to the legal, political, and economic development of the nation, and the accomplishment of its citizens. There are more than 200 Connecticut institutions, large and small, that house archival materials. The Connecticut State Archives today has more than 45,000 cubic feet of records that document the functions of state and local government, as well as private institutions and organizations and the lives of individuals, both great and small. Governor Malloy has graciously issued a proclamation honoring Archives Month, which I would like to read for you now. State of Connecticut, by His Excellency Daniel P. Malloy, Governor, an official statement. Whereas archival institutions in Connecticut are crucial to collecting, preserving, and making accessible records that document the history of Connecticut and its people, and whereas historical records provide citizens with a window into the development and implementation of public policy and the evolution of human rights, property rights, legislation, and constitutional law, and whereas Connecticut's archivists enable public leaders and the electorate to understand public issues and make informed decisions, and whereas dedicated archivists make one-of-a-kind historical records available, and whereas the Society of American Archivists and the Council of State Archivists have designated October as American Archives Month, now therefore, I, Daniel P. Malloy, Governor of the State of Connecticut, do hereby officially proclaim the month of October 2017 as Connecticut Archives Month in the state of Connecticut. We selected the Yale Indian Papers Project as a topic for this year's Archives Month Third Thursday talk because it demonstrates how collaboration and technology can be used to make accessible New England Native American primary sources materials in a way that wasn't possible before now. By providing images, annotated transcripts, and other editorial interventions, students, educators, researchers, Native American tribal members, and the general public gain visual and intellectual access to significant historical documents for the purpose of teaching, scholarly analysis, and research. Our presenters this afternoon are Paul Grant-Costa, who's the Executive Director and Director of the Yale Indian Papers Project. He holds a PhD in Theoretical Linguistics from the University of Connecticut, a Juris Doctor degree from the UConn Law School, and a PhD in American Studies from Yale. Paul's research interests are Native American communities in southeastern New England, the Native Atlantic world, colonial America, Native American-Black relations, and federal recognition of Native tribes. Toby Glaza is a former senior researcher at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center and land management coordinator for the Eastern Pequot Tribal Nation. Toby holds an MA in ethnobotany from Connecticut College, which is the study of how primitive societies in various parts of the world use local plants. I had to look that up. In addition to his recent work with Connecticut Native people, he has worked for the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe, Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, and a variety of other projects in New England. So please join me in welcoming Paul Grant-Costa and Toby Glaza.
Thank you. It's nice to see so many old faces here. Sorry. So many familiar faces of old friends, I meant to say. Gee. I've been coming to the State Library since Kevin was a teenager, and that's a long time, I would think. So what we're going to be doing today is I'll be talking about the Yale Indian Papers Project. It first started as an idea many years ago, and then it turned into a scholarly editing endeavor, and collaborative research initiatives. Now, Toby will do the first part of the scholarly editing endeavor, and I'll come in the second part to finish up on the other side. So, Toby.
So, the scholarly editing component of the Yale Indian Papers project is essentially the what of the project. About 15 years ago or so, Paul and I were working with different researchers, native and non-native, on a variety of projects. Some of them were federal acknowledgement projects, some of them were museum related, some of these projects were had to do with any number of different cultural resource management issues that these native communities were working with. And one of the frustrations that they came across was the inability to have access to materials that they needed that addressed whatever their concerns were. And so that was a big hurdle, and those challenges to access were both visual as well as intellectual. And that was really the germ for the Yale Indian Papers project. So essentially, what I'm going to be talking about is a recovery of a body of work. As many of you know, primary source materials have dispersed. They represent a shared history, but they're no longer just in Connecticut. The Connecticut State Library has a wonderful, vast, rich collection. But as this slide shows, there are many other collections and materials in other parts of the country, other parts of the state, and internationally. And that can be a daunting task for a scholar or a researcher to try to identify these collections and then travel to those repositories. Difficult to ID the collections, difficult to raise the money to travel. When a researcher does arrive at an institution, sometimes these materials are in such poor shape, go back one, that they are necessarily removed from public access. You can see the close-up here of that document. It's held together with the cotton thread. So something like that would be an example of a material that you wouldn't want people to handle. And so as a researcher coming in, you think you're going to look at something and you're not able to look at it. Finally, in instances where there are facsimiles available, where the original has been pulled, sometimes, not always, but sometimes they're of such quality that it makes it a challenge, especially when the microfilm is old. This is an example of a document that is here in the Connecticut Archives Indian Papers series. It's an image from the microfilm. You can see it's extremely faded. All right, we'll try it this way. Extremely faded and streaked and difficult to read. In instances where there are high quality reproductions, this is the first 8 or so lines of that particular document, you can see that you run into another obstacle, and that is an intellectual obstacle. The content of the document is difficult to obtain because it's written in this case, in secretary hand. So it somehow doesn't even look like English when you first look at it, but when you get practiced, you can decipher it. But if you're on a fellowship or on a grant or just have a very short period of time at an institution, it is difficult to sit and transcribe. You think you're going to go through a couple of different collections and you end up spending your entire time working on one document. Another sort of challenge to full access to materials can come in an unexpected way. Oftentimes there are transcriptions that are available associated with some of these materials. So this is a transcription of a document that's part of the Ezra Stiles collection held at the Beinecke at Yale. And I found this online. I don't know what I was searching on, but I searched on a name and this came up. It's part of the collections of the Massachusetts Historical Society, their publications. It was published in 1809. And it's an excellent entry into the material. But what you find when you begin to look at it is that there really were no editorial standards back in 1809. So you get good information, you also miss, when you look at the original, other bits of information that were omitted because there was not this editorial standard. So you can see all of these different challenges can make it difficult to have what we call full access to material. And this is just one example of why this means something. It may seem like it's just an academic exercise, but in this case, this is the last page of a petition, an 1873 petition. Difficult to read because it is a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy, and this is what many of the communities, native and non-native, are working with when they are going through information that's been compiled over the years by research teams. And it's a signatory list at the end of a petition that's not really that old, 1873. It's in script that's legible, but because of this copying, there are sections that are difficult to read. And this actually had some bearing on the Eastern Pequot's attempt for federal acknowledgement. That was transcribed originally as, and this is a close-up from the document, that was transcribed originally as "I am, as said, Hasman children." And you can kind of follow along and read that. It doesn't mean anything. It's nonsensical. In other instances, it was transcribed and made its way into the formal record as illegible, which I think is a much more conservative option. But when we got together a team of researchers, native and non-native historians, tribal historians, to look at a high-quality, high-resolution, high-quality image, what came instead of "I am, as said, Hasman Childru" was Tamar S. and her 9 children. And so it actually fit in. Tamar S. Stood for Tamar Sebastian, and what this did was something significant. It put this particular family, this progenitor family and her 9 children, on the reservation, in the reservation community 30 years prior than what was thought. So these accurate transcriptions and access to high quality, high resolution images has a real consequence in many cases, and this is just one example. So what Paul and I hoped to do, and others, was to mitigate these challenges and to bring together thousands and thousands of primary source materials that deal with native New England communities from 1600s all the way up to the 1900s, from multiple institutions into one easily accessible digital archive or digital platform. And what we wanted to achieve was something more than just a static holding tank for these materials. There is value in just having an image and having metadata. That is, it is valuable, it's very valuable, but we wanted to add more voices, more perspective, and more value. And so we have continually been looking for the right platform. Initially, it was going to be in the form of a book. This was 15 years ago. And so you can see how things have changed. Then we went with the emerging technology of the CD, the CD-ROM that now is ancient. And then, of course, with the advent of the web, a digital platform that could be updated and added to was the obvious choice. And so where we stand right now with the help of our funders, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the NHPRC, which is the funding arm for the National Archives, Yale, Harvard, CLEAR, Mellon, and the Arcadia Fund, we are at the point where we've been able to establish partnerships with different institutions. You'll see we've got just a list here of some of them. The ones on the left-hand side are sort of smaller historical societies, smaller institutions. And then on the right-hand side in blue, you'll see the Connecticut State Library is prominent there in the middle. We've got some larger institutions that represent cultural heritage institutions from other countries, other states, native communities, and so forth. So all of these partnerships, each one of them is a little different, but they contribute material to this digital platform. They've allowed us to image the material if it isn't already imaged. And many of you here remember the days when Paul and I were in, and Brian Parker in there taking photographs and asking for material that was tucked away in different places. And I guess this is a shout out to the staff in the archives, because a project like ours isn't able to really succeed without these kind of partnerships and without the institutional knowledge. So thank you. So finally, we have a platform, but don't get used to it because it's actually changing. This is where we are right now, but as technology dictates, we've got to continually change. So our platform now is for those of you who are interested in the tech side, is a Blacklight Fedora Hydra complex. And that's about as much as I can tell you without putting myself to sleep. But this is what our search, the basic search page looks like. We haven't really done much in terms of customizing it. It's a very vanilla page. You've got a search box up above, and you've got certain fields that you can search through, and you have refined browsing on the left-hand side. If we were to just click on search, it would pull up all of the records, and it would look something like this. I think that's fairly updated. There's a little over 2,000 records, many of them coming from the Connecticut State Library and the Connecticut Historical Society. Each one of these results can then be further expanded, as you would expect. You can click on one of the records, it pulls up rich metadata, which actually, if this were live, we could scroll down and it would just keep going and going. As well as an image and then two buttons underneath. If you can't read what those say, it says annotation and scholarly transcription, and I'll go through those to show you what those are. If you're interested in the image and you want to see a close-up, you can click on it and get in fairly close. Everybody always wishes that their image viewer was better than it is, and we wish the same thing, but if there's an area of interest in the document, you can really zoom in. We try to transcribe them to the best of our ability. Every once in a while, there's words that we can't get, and so it allows the general public to go in and try to suss out what those illegible words are. You can see here, this is probably a piece of stain from Scotch tape that was holding this document together. If you go back to the document details or the metadata page, you can click on the scholarly transcription button, which brings you a word-for-word facsimile transcription of the document. So what is on the page is what is here. It's got the spelling mistakes, it has the different characters like the long S, it has interlineations, it has crossouts, it has raised and lowered text. We try not to change it. We try to keep it as faithful to the original document as possible. This was something that some of the elders were very interested in seeing. They wanted to be able to look at the image of a document and look at the transcription and read along. And this was the best way that we felt we could do that. It's called a facsimile transcription. And the other button that I just jumped ahead to is what's called an annotated transcription. You can see that there's a slightly different look here because it jumps to a different platform. This is one of the things that we're dealing with in our new technology, is to get rid of that, to make it a bit more seamless rather. But you can see it's got a different look. It's regularized, so there are natural line breaks. All the spelling mistakes are fixed. We've got regularized spellings for names in places so that it becomes searchable. We've got some information along the side here, so some of the native communities that this document is associated with. And you can see probably, even from a distance, the blue hyperlinks within the text. So in instances where there needs to be further explanation, we provide footnotes. In instances where a person is mentioned and we know who that person is, whether it's by proper name or by a pronoun, like the first one says mother, well, we know who that person is. You can click on that, and what it reveals is, this wasn't mother, but this was Robert Ashbow in the text there. Fairly meticulous biographies that are put together for both native and non-native people. More often than not, the biographies for the Indian or native people are ones that need to be generated through primary research. There aren't too many secondary sources out there that provide information on these individuals. And in some cases, not the case with Robert Ashbow, but with other people, it may be the only instance in which an individual appears in the historical record. And so we try to generate. And same goes for place. And this is a work in progress. we're attempting to do that. We're shifting to a new platform, so within probably 3 to 6 months, we'll have a new platform which is called Mukatu. This R here is silent. It's a Australian Aboriginal word meaning safekeeping place, and it was created for Australian Aboriginal communities originally so that they could have more control in terms of collaborative sharing and vetting of material that they may or may not want to have public. It is now an open source platform that can be used by anybody who's dealing with Native communities. It's a great platform for sharing information and for getting feedback and for making sure that there is control in that sharing. I could go on and on about it, and maybe if people have questions, we can talk afterwards. That particular platform allows a lot of the same capabilities that we have with the Blacklight platform, but it gives us the opportunity to have document summaries and some additional metadata, and it creates that seamless look that we want. And it also allows for an easier display and searchability of geographic locations. So every document, we can select a geographical point at this time, although later we want to be able to do shape files, and to either display them and or search based on them. So that's a functionality that we're excited about developing. As it stands right now, most of the material that we have in the old platform and in the new platform are manuscripts. So petitions, letters, those sorts of things, but more and more we're getting images and maps and drawings. And so what this allows us to do by bringing in materials from different institutions, having multiple partners and having multiple perspectives, what it allows us to do is to certainly display and share a document like this, which is from the Ezra Stiles collection at Yale. And it is a recollection that was recorded by Ezra Stiles probably in the 1750s or 1760s about something that took place a generation earlier. And it describes Ninigrit II, so one of the leaders of the Narragansetts, and his wife at the time, it was his fifth wife, a young woman. It describes their interactions, and one night in particular, and some of you may be familiar with this because it's been published in a couple of other publications. They had a ceremony, it was outdoors, and in the morning, Ninigrit woke up and saw his young wife sleeping a little bit too closely to another man. And so she was, in his eyes, being unfaithful. She was accused of infidelity, and she was cast out of the community back to her home village in Connecticut, but not before he put 3 strikes or scored her face with a knife in derision, as it was said in the document. So it gives you a little bit of insight into marriage and that sort of dynamic. We also are able to share a document from the Connecticut State Library, the Connecticut Archives. It's a 1720s petition from the Eastern Pequot in which they say to the General Assembly, please help us. We're being encroached upon by our non-native neighbors. They are letting their cattle into our cornfields. They're fencing off our lands. And what's interesting about it is that the first 2 signatories are women. The second one is a woman named Asquasuda, and she makes her mark. And so it allows people who are interested in exploring the role of women in leadership in Native American communities, it gives a little bit of information about that. A third document that has emerged through our process is another one here at the Connecticut State Library, which is in the New London County court records, the inquests. And for those of you who don't know what an inquest is, when there was a body that was found and the cause of death wasn't obvious, there would be a number of people, sometimes it was described as 12 indifferent men brought together to view the body and try to determine what the cause of death was it suspicious, and do we need to investigate further. So it was sort of that first step when a body was found. So in 1752, this particular document highlights a very tragic situation on the Eastern Pequot Reservation in which a 90-plus-year-old woman was killed by her 90-plus-year-old husband. They had a domestic dispute, and then he ended up taking his own life. So sort of tragic. But what is really interesting about this, when you look at these three documents as separate pieces, you might say, wow, big deal. But what's revealed, or what was revealed, is that this is all the same woman. The young wife, the daughter of an Eastern Pequot sachem, marries Ninigrit II, gets kicked out to her home community. The Eastern Pequots want to attack the Narragansetts, but their anger is quelled. A number of years later, she rises to a leadership position through heredity, is a very successful leader, petitions the General Assembly for a number of years. And then towards the end of her life, after successfully getting a petition granted by the General Assembly, she falls prey to her angry husband. And the reason we were able to bring this all together is, one, we were able to pull these pieces from different institutions. Primarily, before, they had been sitting in their siloed institutions. They had never really spoken to one another. So it was actually a newspaper article about this particular murder-suicide that tied all of these pieces together and creates a very rich story of this woman's life over the course of 80, 90 years that had previously been unknown. So this is one example of what we hope to be able to do many, many, many times over, both in terms of individuals and in terms of communities, and then in terms of larger themes in Native American studies throughout southern New England. So this is the point at which I turn it over to Paul.
Can I come back? So, Toby explained what we do. I'm going to explain now why we do what we do. And so, for those of you who have been in any advanced study in history, there's a difference between history, things on the ground, and things on the ground in the colonial period was that, the things on the ground were that Indian people lived on colonial land under an imperial empire. And that's how things were. That's what the facts were. But when people write historiography is how people write about history. When people write about history, some of the first things to go are the Indians. You can read books on Connecticut history on the colonial period. There's no mention of Indians at all. And then there are also some times when the empire is gone too. So the only perspective you have of Connecticut history or of colonial history is from a colonial perspective. So basically, for many of us, I grew up in Massachusetts, and so for many of us, the last mention you heard of New England Indians, Connecticut or Massachusetts Indians, were after they put the dishes away at the first Thanksgiving. Then you don't hear of Indians anymore. At least that's the way I grew up, but you really didn't. And what that leads to is some really skewed ways of looking at Indians. People say, well, there's always some type of inquiry. I was reminded the other day that when people say you're Irish or you're French Canadian or whatever, people say, oh, that's interesting. If you say I'm Native American, oh, really? You are? So there's a questioning of Native American presence on the land, presence because of many different things, because of writings, because people sometimes have been detached from understanding Native history or seeing Native history either in the books that are written or in just in many different discourses. So this continues in many ways. This is the cover of the football thing, football game at Yale last year, and it has some, it depicts Indians in a way that is probably a little stereotypical. You wouldn't necessarily think if this were African Americans that it would be proper to put some stereotyped figures there. And so when it comes to Native Americans, it seems that a lot of people think of Native Americans like this, wearing buckskins and living in this time period. They don't have a concept that Native Americans have a long continued history and presence in Connecticut and Massachusetts, and that there are documents that reveal this. And so basically, okay, this isn't changing to the next line. Let me see if I can get, yeah, okay. So basically, there's an imbalance, and how do we correct the imbalance? And first is recovering the body of work. And the body of, that's what Toby was talking about. We go all over the place, and we collect images of materials on Native Americans, and we work on them by transcribing them, annotating and publishing them. The second thing we do is reinscribe indigeneity. And what I'm saying here is talking about how to bring Native research into the 21st century. And so this is sort of the methodology that we're doing to bring Native, the study of Native Americans in the 21st century. So recovering a body of work, reinscribe indigeneity. And what I mean by that is that in the work that people do in the scholarly editing community, or the scholarly community, for a long time, this is what the staff looked like. This is the staff of the Mark Twain edition of the papers. It's from 1964. I'm not knocking that papers. They're great. They're a great edition. And, but you see that they're mostly men, white men. There's one woman. But they're mostly men, and these were gathered from top academic institutions all over the country. When you're dealing with Native American communities, it's a little different, because knowledge in Native American communities, like many minority communities, we find them in different people. They're not the high academics, but we find them in elders, in medicine men, medicine women, tribal chairs. There are a whole bunch of people who have knowledge through oral history or family stories that help us understand the materials. So basically, one of the most important tenet of the project is that Native people must be stakeholders in the project as colleagues, intellectuals, and the Native voice. Toby and I are not Native people. We can't represent we can't represent the Native community, although we've done a lot of work in the Native community. Like I said, we need to collaborate more with Native people to get the Native voice. And this approach is a little different than the anthropological approach taken perhaps by anthropologists and archaeologists in the last from the 1970s and 80s, where they would come into a community, a Native community, ask questions and get all this information, and then leave, write an academic article, never vet it through, never go back to the community and say, is this right or wrong? And then that article can be used against them, or there's no communication. So that's a way of acting and working that we thought we didn't want to replicate. So basically, these are the main points of how we work. The second one is engaging in meaningful collaboration. And that means a whole bunch of things. Meaningful collaboration means treating Native partners as true partners and not sort of like, oh yeah, we'll make all the decisions without you. That's not a meaningful relationship. If it was a marriage, that's not going to work. So a meaningful collaboration. And so we do this in many different ways. We work with tribal communities in different ways. Sometimes we deal with elder groups, councils. Sometimes we work with tribal councils. Sometimes we work with the chief of the tribe. But in each case, there's communication. What we also try to do is, for a long time, the documents that went into the Indian papers at first were documents that Toby and I thought, oh wow, these are great. These documents should be in the collection because we like them. One of the things that we've sort of, as we evolved in the project, one of the things that we've tried to initiate is a fundamental documents initiative. And each community, each society has their own important fundamental documents. For us in the United States as Americans, it could be the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights. Those are formal documents. It could be something like Gettysburg Address, which is less formal, and perhaps FDR's Declaration Against the War in Japan. These are all important to American society. So what we wanted to do is we asked the tribes to say, what kind of information do you want us to try to provide? And it's been sort of interesting in some of the responses. Try to find some documents by this person, or try to find some documents that sort of explain this type of activity. So getting the tribe's input is sort of an important part of what we do. The other thing is we have a Native internship initiative, which brings Native people into work to help us do what we do, but it also trains Native people to sort of bring back. Now, some of these internships right now have been with the Mohegan tribe, but we're open to we have some students at Yale, some Native students who have worked with us, who can bring this back to their own tribal communities and maybe start a similar project. But there's an initiative we're working on now that I think is wonderful. Right now, in the interest of time, I won't talk about the Samson Aka music, but this Indian Melodies, which you guys have in your own collection, I looked that up. Indian Melodies, it's by Thomas Cummock, who's a Brotherton Indian. And the Brotherton are formed by 7 Christian Indian communities in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New York, who, with Samson Occam, went to upstate New York and as their own community, and then they moved out west to Wisconsin. And Thomas Cummock is one of those people. And he wrote a songbook of sort of worship music in something called shape note. And I'll tell you, I can't read shape note. I can't read music. And so I always thought the puzzle was, to me, is like, how do you annotate a songbook? Well, for people who can't read notes, you annotate it by letting people listen to it. So we have an initiative that's a pretty interesting initiative. It's basically the music, working with tribal communities. We're working with the Brotherton community, well, we worked with a little bit of the Mohegan community. And it takes students from Yale Divinity School and Institute of Sacred Music who will be performing this, and scholarship. Students are learning a lot about the songbook, about working with Native tribes, and working in an ethical way. And so an ethical way, I'm meaning doing what we're trying to do is interact with the tribe when you're doing any type of research. And so this is a project that is really interesting and that we're moving forward on. And so hopefully soon you'll be able to hear this. Maybe by next year you'll be able to hear some of this music. So how does the Native involvement help the Indian Papers project? I could go through many examples, but I just want to show one. Ezra Stiles, when he was writing meeting different people, he met this older woman who told a story that when she was young, as a little girl, she went to an Indian powwow. And at that powwow, she saw an Indian, young Indian girl with her mother and her aunt. All three were Indian people. And this was in that powwow. And they were all dressed in their finest clothes. And that the Indians went into the crowd, and there was some big noise, And then a little while later, the mother and the aunt came back and they were crying. And the colonists asked them, "Why are you crying and where's the little girl?" And they said, "They'll never see her again." And so writers, Stiles, and other people up into the 1960s, I've seen this in print, sort of suggested that native New Englanders killed their kids. They sacrificed them up to the gods. And I thought, yeah, that's a little weird. You know, that just doesn't seem, because we don't see that evidence in other writings. So I asked Trudy Lamb Richmond, who was a Scotticook elder, I said, "Trudy, can you help us understand this document?" And she said, "You know what? It was probably a puberty ritual, that this girl went in as a little girl, and you won't see her again, because when she comes out, she's not going to be a little girl, she's going to be a young adult." And so that's what the colonists sort of misunderstood this whole episode. But like I said, this continued. So in the Forest History of the Indians of Connecticut, he's got that in there. Well, he suggests it in there. And like I said, it was replicated in 1960. So how has the project helped Native communities? Well, it's done it in a number of ways. One is it's helped identifying the hidden. Toby and I had gone down to the Leffingwell House and Museum, and we found a transcription of a document that was pretty interesting. It was the death, some Indian woman was dying, and it was her death confession. Confession meaning profession of faith, not like she did anything wrong, not the criminal confession, it was more a profession of faith. So she was they wrote this down, and so we said, "Can we see the original?" And when we looked at the original that they had in the back, as we were going on, we said, "We recognize that handwriting." Well, it was Samson Occam's handwriting. So we were able to go to the tribe, the Mohegans, to the elders and say, "We think this is Samson Occam's writing." And, we asked them what did they think and everything. So, identifying the hidden. Toby has done also some pretty good work in the Massachusetts materials that we've been doing on finding documents written by William Apes that haven't been identified by him before. So, like I said, once you get to see materials all the time, you get to recognize handwriting. The other thing is that some of the work that we do supports oral traditions. There's an elder, I don't know if you know Tall Oak, he's an elder who's a Narragansett, Pequot, and Wampanoag elder. And he said that in his family, there are always stories that that Indians after the King Philip's War were taken off to the islands, not just in the Caribbean, but places like the Azores and elsewhere. And people said to him, "Where's your evidence?" And he said, "Well, my grandmother said that, and also her grandmother said that." And people said, we're not going to use that as evidence, and so we're not going to publish that. Well, the materials that we've been finding is that we went to Cambridge in England, and we found a lot of materials that sort of they indicate that Indians were taken off to Tangier in Spain and then sold on the king's galley ships. And this was something that some businessmen in London and people in the Royal Navy were thinking to do every year. They thought that these rowers on the king's galley ships, that's a galley ship, it's a ship that's pulled by oars. They thought that these men and women were pulling these oars too. They pulled better than the Moorish slaves that they had captured too. And so what the plan was going to be is to come back every year in a harvest and take native people from New England. So it's sort of like a slavery capture thing. So the whole point of this is we were bringing some documentary evidence to Tall Oak's oral history. The other thing is that in doing all this, we find a paradigm shift. We find a paradigm shift from victimhood to native agency. And what that means is that a lot of people think of natives as just merely victims of history. And, well, that could certainly be said. But through a lot of the documents, especially the documents you have here in the Connecticut Archives, the Indian Papers series, you have a lot of papers on the Mohegan case. And the Mohegan case is sort of interesting. I did my dissertation on it. It was that interesting. It might not be that interesting to read, but it was about a lawsuit between the Mohegan tribe and the colony of Connecticut. It lasted for 70 years, pretty long for a case. But it was brought in the Privy Council. And so Indians were basically using the legal system against the colony. They couldn't fight them militarily, but they were fighting them in the courtroom. So the thing is that some of these documents show this paradigm shift. And then how is the project help scholarship? Well, you know, these are just some of the books. We have many more books. I think there are like maybe 25 books or more that have been written by scholars using using the papers from the Indian Papers Project. Also, there have been many articles in dissertations and student papers as well. And some of these materials, like Derek Grant, who wrote on the Treaty of Hartford, he used the digital copy of the material that we had here. And he also looked at, we have a digital copy of the Treaty of Hartford that's actually in London. And the interesting thing is that this copy you have here is a copy that was made in 1743 during that Mohegan case. The actual Treaty of Hartford was in 1638. So the one here is not a contemporary copy, it was one made later on. The copy that's in London was made in 1660, I think 1666. And that one is a little bit different from this copy. It has more provisions, but the thing is that the London copy, it's at the bottom, if you look at the paper, it looks like it was torn. So the paper, or not torn, it was sort of like old and let go. So the bottom provisions are lost, or they're somewhere in the collections in the British Museum. The British Library. But that's sort of an interesting thing. But the Treaty of Hartford that here has been used in scholarship. This is a great document. There are a lot of documents of Indians asking for education because they want to better their tribal communities. Lucy Ann Levin, who's an archaeologist and anthropologist, she's doing a study of the western part of Connecticut, and she's been using this in her work. Again, coming from the State Library. Then there's another I'm just showing you different, did I skip one? Yeah, I think I did. Then this one is the testament, well, I'm seeing it on the screen. Yeah, the testimony of Goodwife Osborne. Very interesting document. This is one of my favorite. When people say, what's your favorite? I sort of say different things, but this one really is my favorite. It's a document about a wife whose son, who's, I believe, like 12 years old, overhears, or an Indian has told him that there was going to be an Indian attack against the colonists over in the, I guess, the Pawcatuck area. And it's interesting because the son hears it in Indian. He listens, he can speak Indian, and then he translates to his mother in English. So here's a cultural broker who's 12 years old. A little Indian, colonial kid can understand Indian, and then, well, he tells his mother that the Indians are planning to attack. And her mother goes to her husband, and he says, don't say anything, you're a tattletale. Don't say anything. And then more Indians come and tell her more information, and she gets worried, and her husband doesn't want her to go and tell. So she eventually goes and tells the colonial authorities, and then there's a big investigation of the matter. And like I said, it's sort of an interesting thing. And I believe that this may be written about in the book on Ninigret that was written, Julie Fisher and David Silverman. And then there's this one, John Plum's map of Mashantucket. So basically, I'm showing you different things that you have in the collection that have been used for research, and all different types of documents. I mean, like I said, this looks like a simple map, but this was very instrumental in trying to lay out the boundaries of, or at least check the boundaries when Mashantucket was when Mashantucket history was being put together. So right now, we're going to this type of, prior when you came to look at materials, you had to look at something like microfilm. Now it's digital form. And that digital form helps scholars, but it also helps institutions like the Connecticut Historical Society, because instead of using the original, you can use a digital version of it. And so basically, that's the Yale Indian Papers project. If you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.